Good afternoon, everybody. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Professor Hal Roth from Brown University. Any one of us in here engaged in contemplative education knows Hal as one of the pioneers, and he's one of the first people, along with a couple of other people in this room, certainly Judith Zimmer Brown, who gave me a name for what I was doing in my classroom about 10 years ago, and it's just really grown from there. Hal's professor of religious studies and the director of the Contemplative Studies Initiative at Brown University. He's a specialist in classical religious thought, Daoism, the comparative study of mysticism, and as I mentioned, a real pioneer in the whole academic field of contemplative studies, as well as the co-chair of this fabulous conference. And he's published over 50 articles, 6 books, and on the history and religious thought of the Daoist tradition. He's been the recipient of many, many grants and fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Chang-Ching Kuo Foundation for International Scholarly Exchange. And on top of that, he is an outstanding human being and a teacher who has influenced the lives of many, many of us in this, who are in this room. And I'm very delighted to introduce him and call him my friend. Hal, over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Aaron. I'd like to dedicate my talk today to my old friend and fellow seeker, Leonard Cohen, who passed away yesterday after a long illness. So I'd like to talk to you today on the theme of what's critical, and I'm using critical in a couple of different meanings, senses, about critical first-person experience, which I feel is foundational to the field of contemplative studies. Perhaps the hallmark of the distinctive forms of the teaching we've developed at Brown and that we've deemed integrative contemplative pedagogy is a method of classroom study of meditation practices that we call critical first-person perspectives. In this method, students try out specific contemplative practices during devoted laboratory sections. We call them med labs. This first-person empirical study is complemented by third-person study of primary texts and their historical and philosophical contexts during weekly lectures and discussion periods. I'll come back to that at the end of my talk. Through this balanced approach, students derive experiential first-person understanding of contemplative practices and at the same time study their cognitive frameworks most importantly, without being asked to believe in their veridicality, which would be required in many other contemplative practice settings. This is a key distinguishing characteristic that differentiates classroom study from practice in a spiritual or religious center, and it is a necessary component of contemplative studies pedagogy in a secular university. We also feel that this is an important component of the training of both humanistic and scientific researchers in the 21st century. This lecture will be mostly devoted to establishing the intellectual foundations of this approach through theory and illustrations, and we'll close with an example from one of the courses we've developed at Brown. The intellectual foundations of the critical first-person approach, that is the hallmark of the contemplative studies methodology, can be found in both the sciences and the humanities. In essence, they restore the respectability of subjective experience that, as Alan Wallace has so masterfully demonstrated, has largely been written out of scientific and humanistic research because of often well-justified concerns over bias and partiality. Indeed, in the political campaign that mercifully just ended this week, we've seen the dangers of relying on subjective and uncritical first-person epistemologies and the various ways in which so-called facts were created and validated by repetition rather than reality testing. For scientific research to be considered valid, it must be repeatable and hence verifiable when done by different labs and research teams. Humanistic scholarship in the field that I know best, that of religious studies, is dominated by the critical study of religious systems that entails a rigorous contextualizing of their historical, social, and political dimensions. While this has had considerable value for the comparative study of religions, it has also unfortunately been taken to the extreme of the complete denial through a kind of explanatory reduction of any of their distinctive epistemic claims. Such a perspective is exclusively a third-person perspective, one that denies as well the value of any kind of first-person epistemologies, automatically identifying them as, quote, subjective, unquote, and therefore unable to be seriously included in rational inquiry. Thus, quote, insider perspectives, unquote, are deprecated in religious studies methodology in favor of the more, quote, objective outsider perspectives. While there are many aspects of religious systems that can best be understood through such a critical perspective, there are some significant claims, those that appeal to direct first-person experience, that simply cannot be understood without directly engaging with first-person epistemologies. The distinctive epistemologies of the field of contemplative studies enable us to include this extremely valuable subjective perspective while at the same time minimizing the personal, temporal, and cultural biases that have led to scientific and humanistic research and teaching to completely reject subjective epistemologies as valid sources of knowledge, especially for the study of human consciousness. In the following lecture, I will offer first a definition of the field of contemplative studies that includes three perspectives: third person, second person, and first person. I will further argue for the existence of another perspective or mode of experience that underlies the other three, what I have called no-person perspectives or epistemologies, and demonstrate how this takes into account the ways in which contemplative practices can produce a freedom from attachment to what James Austin has called egocentric subjectivity, and give rise to what he has called allocentric subjectivity that yields a cognitive clarity that fully justifies bringing first-person experience into the realm of serious scientific research, humanistic scholarship, and teaching within the academy. So throughout the talk, just to help orient you at where I am in the talk, I will, as I begin a different section, this is the overall outline of the talk, and I will throw up and underline, I might end up throwing up at some point. I haven't done that yet, and I hope none of you will. I will put up on the screen an outline of exactly where we are in the talk. So I want to talk first about the field of contemplative studies, which examines the varieties of contemplative practices and experience across cultures and tradition and throughout human history. It focuses on the many ways human beings have found to concentrate, broaden, and deepen conscious awareness as the gateway to cultivating more meaningful, ethically responsible, and personally fulfilling lives. I got a little creative with these slides. Then I surprised myself. Scholarship on this emerging field studies these experiences from a multidisciplinary approach that includes the humanities and the sciences, cultivates first-person knowledge of them, and critically assesses their nature and significance. Of course, if we are talking about contemplative studies, we have to proffer a definition of contemplation. So as we define it, contemplation is the focusing of the attention in a sustained fashion, leading to my pointer doesn't work. Deepened states of concentration, tranquility, and insight. Self-contextualizing experiences that are the basis of other regarding virtues, such as empathy, compassion, and love. And it really occurs on a spectrum from the rather common experiences of absorption in an activity, such as reading a book or playing a sport, to the profound and transformative experiences that are deliberately cultivated within religious traditions. When intentionally cultivated, contemplative experiences can become the basis of a clear and spontaneous cognition that is able to attend effortlessly to whatever presents itself. Such experiences can often serve as the basis for the development of various other regarding ethical orientations, such as empathy, compassion, and loving kindness. Results of this type have become the basis for serious scientific research in areas such as effortless attention, flowing cognition, mindfulness, and compassion. Contemplative studies derives its orientation from the work of the late cognitive neuroscientist Francisco Varela, one of the founders of the Mind and Life Institute. He was influenced by both phenomenology and the cognitive sciences. Varela makes a crucial distinction between first-person and third-person events and experiences. By first-person events, we mean the lived experience associated with cognitive and mental events. Sometimes terms such as phenomenal consciousness or even qualia are used, but it is natural to speak of conscious experience or simply experience. These terms imply here that the process being studied appears as relevant and manifest for a self or subject that can provide an account. They have a subjective side. That's first person. In contrast, third-person descriptions concern the descriptive experience associated with the study of other natural phenomena. Although there are always human agents in science who provide and produce descriptions, the contents of such descriptions are not clearly or immediately linked to the human agents who came up with them. That is, everybody who provides scientific theories, research, analysis. I mean, everybody's coming at this from the standpoint of their own subjectivity. So it's very important also that we take subjective experience into account. Such objective descriptions do have a subjective social dimension, but this dimension is hidden within the social practices of science. The ostensive, direct reference is to the objective, to the outside, the content of current science that we have today concerning various natural phenomena such as physics and biology. We're all familiar with this third-person perspective. Contemplative studies as a field embraces the recommendations of Varela and the philosopher Evan Thompson that serious scientific and philosophical study of contemplation must take into account first-person subjective experience. A second significant distinction is the interlinked concepts of second-person experience and intersubjectivity. The elaboration of the IU hypothesis asserts that human beings are fundamentally and biologically social animals. And that, as Evan Thompson argues, individual human consciousness is formed in the dynamic interrelation of self and other and is therefore inherently intersubjective. Danish philosopher Dan Zahavi adds, the phenomenologists never conceive of intersubjectivity as an objectively existing structure in the world which can be described and analyzed from a third-person perspective. On the contrary, intersubjectivity is a relationship between subjects which must be analyzed from a first and second-person perspective. So from these perspectives, third-person experience entails an activity of consciousness that objectifies an apparently external world of things and facts, as well as an internal world of ideas and feelings. This third-person objectification of an internal world of experience is significant in the construction of the idea of a fixed or permanent self-identity. It is also the root of self-consciousness. Second-person experience involves intersubjective communication that at its best is spontaneous and unself-conscious and is grounded in empathy inherent in the IU relationship. First-person experience is the basis of subjectivity, the experience of what we commonly perceive as the internal contents of our consciousness or minds. Consistent with this model, I would like to add a fourth dimension of experience that I will call no-person experience. And that's where we are now in the talk. No-person experience is immediate experience in the present moment that is non-intentional, that is non-will directed, non-self-referential. It occurs within the experiencing subject, within first-person experience on a moment-to-moment basis. Derived this concept from a number of extant sources, both Western and Asian. The first is William James's notion of pure experience as expressed in the following passage. The instant field of the present is always experienced in its pure state, plain, unqualified actuality, a simple that, as yet undifferentiated as to thing or thought. When one reflects on the activity of knowing, experience splits into two aspects, one of which becomes the knowing subject and the other the known object. Thus, for James, prior to the retrospective experience, and I mean momentary retrospective experience that divides into subject and object. Pure experience is itself a unity that is neither subject nor object. This basic epistemology is supported by the Buddhist phenomenology of Zen philosopher Katsuki Sekida. He asserts that the multifaceted flow of consciousness is constituted of many individual moments of awareness he calls nens. First nen is a moment of pure sensation or pure thought. Second nen is the immediate objectifying of that first moment. It is the reflecting action of consciousness that cognizes the first nen and makes us aware of it as distinct. And third nen takes second nen moments and synthesizes them into complex cognitions. For example, in the very moment that the clapper struck the bell, there was a pure experience, a first nen experience of the perception of that immediately becomes objectified in the next moment into bell or sound and you. And then third nen comes in and all kinds of other layers of objectification come in. You know, the Roth rang the bell. Why did Roth ring the bell? Did he do it to wake us up? What's he up to up there? I mean, all these other third, you know, why am I so annoyed by the fact that he rang the bell? I used to use this. I used to chair the faculty committee on tenure, promotions, and appointments. I spent a year doing that, and whenever the discussion, I really wanted to bring the discussion to an end, I just rang the bell. It really works remarkably well. But there were certain colleagues of mine who just never, they said, Hal, don't do that. But I kept doing it because I was the chair of the committee, so. What's that Tom Petty song? It's good to be king. So, third nen then adds the sense of self-identity that is the cause of egotistical bias and suffering according to Buddhists because we become so attached to it. Zen meditation for Sekida develops the ability to hone in on only the first nen. To do this is to develop what Buddhists call samadhi, or the experience of meditative concentration. Sekida's thought complements that of James in that for him, James's pure experience is the equivalent of first nen experience. The experience is noetic, is bearing information, spontaneous, filled with varying content, and can be a thought, feeling, intuition, perception. It then becomes cognized and integrated into the flow of consciousness. Too soon. Into the flow of consciousness by the process of objectification inherent in what Sekida calls the reflecting action of consciousness that occurs in second nen and then subsequently third nen. Recent research in the brain sciences supports James's understanding and Sekida's concept of first nen. This research has identified two types of cognition that recognize environmental data spontaneously and without intentionality. First, we have the research of Aaron Seitz and my colleague Takeo Watanabe. They've pioneered something they call task-irrelevant perceptual learning. Task-irrelevant perceptual learning. Basically, the outline, the parameter of what they do is that they have a very strong stimulus, visual or auditory, and that they then present conflicting stimuli at different levels of intensity, either in the visual field or the auditory field. And at 80%, 70%, 60%, 50, 40, 30, 25, the stronger signal blocks out the weaker signal. But at 22% intensity, subjects actually perceive the data that's coming in the weaker signal without attending to it, without focusing on it, without having a self concentrate on it. It's very, very interesting stuff. The acronym is TIPL, which I like, Task-Irrelevant Perceptual Learning. And secondly, Arthur Reber has researched a major mode of cognition called tacit knowledge. I'll come back to that in a minute. So what is task-irrelevant perceptual learning? So the authors state, the basic phenomenon is that stimulus features that are irrelevant to the subject's task can be learned due to their constant presentation during task performance. TIPL is a form of passive cognition in which information is processed while deliberately attending to a different, much stronger stimulus. As Seitz writes, task-irrelevant perceptual learning is distinguished from other forms of perceptual learning in that it is not dependent on attention being directed toward nor having awareness of the stimulus array during that period of learning. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that literally cannot be put into words. We have four basic categories of tacit knowledge. It often can't be explained. It can't be made explicit. We exercise it without being aware that we are exercising it, like driving or catching a baseball. And we exercise it without being able to explain what we're doing, like walking or running. Tacit knowledge is often contrasted with propositional knowledge. Which is derived from logical analysis that separates itself from what it is analyzing. So it is a knowing how. Tacit knowledge is a knowing how that involves embodied understanding, often put into actions, whereas propositional knowledge is a knowing that. The research on Tipple points to perception and cognition that occurs without being actively pursued within the context of a self or self-identity. It is non-intentional and hence spontaneous, and I postulate that something like this is going on in no-person experience, in James's concept of pure experience, and in Secuta's first nin experience. A perceptual world is cognized on a moment-to-moment basis before we bring that cognition to full awareness. So this research on tacit knowledge points to cognition and action that occurs spontaneously and non-intentionally that leads to the automatization of a whole range of tasks we perform on a daily basis. It's impossible to pay attention to every single item of perceptual data that arises in performing these tasks. When we're first learning them, we inevitably have to be much more intentional about taking in these data, but after they become automatic, we sometimes perform them without much intentionality or self-consciousness at all. Such non-intentional and cognitively accurate experience is not only possible, but I would contend it has been deliberately cultivated in many of the world's great contemplative traditions. Following such a practice removes one of the main reasons why subjective experience has been taboo in the sciences and the humanities. Subjective experience does not inevitably have to be biased and hence distorted. It's possible for both researchers and subjects to cultivate this spontaneous and accurate cognition through serious contemplative practices. One can develop the ability through intense Zen meditation, a whole variety of mindfulness techniques, various still and moving meditations such as Qigong and Tai Chi, various forms of yoga, and many other practices to allow the clear cognition of what James calls pure experience, Secuta calls first nin experience, and in the realm of contemplative epistemology, I am calling no-person experience. The results of such practices have been identified, the ultimate results of such practices have been identified in recent neuroscientific research that talks about two categories of meditation practice, concentrative and receptive. Concentrative meditation techniques involve top-down focusing of the attention on a specific mental or sensory activity, concentrating on the breath, concentrating on a mantra, concentrating on a particular image. And repeated practice over time can lead to one-pointed modes of attention and ultimately to experiences of peaceful calm and tranquility and clarity. Receptive meditation is a more effortless, involuntary, and inclusive form of practice in which one learns to allow any thoughts, feelings, and sensations to arise while remaining an unattached observer without judgment or analysis. So forms of noting and labeling that we find in the Vipassana tradition fall into this category. Simply open awareness falls into this category. This taps into spontaneous, pre-attentive, intuitive mechanisms that can lead to forms of choiceless awareness, free of thoughts. The results of such practices include a shift from what James Austin calls a self-referential, egocentric cognitive orientation to an other-referential, allocentric orientation. And this is, Jim has just published a new book. It's another book in the series of books on Zen and the brain. And I believe some of these copies are being sold outside, and maybe Jim is actually doing book signing. So in addition to improved attentional focus, these results include increased body awareness, improved emotional regulation through decreased reactivity, and detachment from identification with a static sense of self. And he makes this contrast between not only these experiences, but brain networks that enforce these. So we've got the clear contrast between self-centered and other referential. Where is it in relation to me, and where is it? Utilizes touch and proprioception, utilizes vision and audition, and these are parts of the brain associated with each of these modes and circuits within the brain. So this leads to important ramifications for the other three modes of experience: third, second, and first person. Increasing detachment from a static sense of self-identity and developing an increasingly allocentric perspective allows one's third-person cognition to be more impartial and unbiased and hence accurate. One's second-person experience to be more complete and fulfilling, and one's first-person experiences to flow unencumbered by the sticky glue of egocentrism and its concomitant endless ruminations and anxieties. So these significant results of contemplative practice for both subjects and researchers are certainly one major aspect of what's critical about critical first-person perspectives. And there is another major aspect to what is critical, and that is the use of third-person textual, historical, and philosophical perspectives to also help establish critical frameworks in which to contextualize first-person and no-person experience. Right. So that's where we are. Here's where we are in the talk. I want to talk about critical third-person epistemologies. So the critical study of religious systems entails a rigorous contextualizing of their historical, social, and political dimensions, as I've said. And this is important. Without it, first-person experience can become narrowly confined to the perspective of the individual person or the particular belief system in which that individual and her contemplative practices are embedded. And this often results in the kinds of biases that have given a bad name to subjective first-person experience. In many forms of first-person experience in the context of religion, ultimately the sources from which the majority of the contemplative practices we study here derive, one must suspend critical judgment and believe in the various truths that the tradition associates with it and sometimes verifies by these contemplative practices. There is an important place for this form of committed first-person learning in our private lives, without a doubt. But we should be careful not to require, we cannot require that kind of commitment in the research we do and in the courses we teach in a secular university. By contrast, critical first-person epistemologies that we advocate in contemplative studies, the need to believe is removed. Furthermore, what's critical about these perspectives is that within them, first-person experiences and their cognitive frameworks are contextualized by third-person scientific and humanistic research. This is significant. The critical contextualization of first-person experience is the sine qua non of reality testing and of interpreting one's experiences in the greater context of intersubjective second-person perspectives and rational and scientific third-person perspectives. This is perhaps best understood through a specific illustration, and I choose one drawn from my own major research field of classical Daoism. And that's where we are now in the talk. All of you are undoubtedly familiar with the Lao Tzu or the Tao Te Ching through some modern context. You may have encountered it in the book's central concept of the Tao or the Way in Benjamin Hoff's very popular 1983 book, The Tao of Pooh, and its successor, The De of Piglet, or perhaps in the well-known recent movie, The Tao of Steve, and there's more. So this is a list of titles that I pulled off Amazon. I won't read all of them for you, but It's a very interesting list of titles. They include, of course, the well-known Tao of physics. Then there's a very unusual one. Let's see, the Tao de Chicken, which I believe is a set of chicken recipes. We also have another very interesting one, the Tao of Capital, Austrian Investing in a Distorted World, which is fairly specific. We have the Tao of Sexology, the Book of Infinite Wisdom. We also have maybe my favorite title, the Tao of Bill Murray, Real Life Stories of Joy, Enlightenment, and Party Crashing. There does not seem to be one overarching meaning or theme in how these authors are defining this term, other than the obvious use of the term, to kind of mean a cool way of doing things. No hint here of anything more than that, or any awareness or concern for what the term meant to the people who first conceived it. For this reason, it is essential that we use historical and textual scholarship to set the work within its original cultural context and to clearly distinguish that context from the ways in which modern authors have sought its contemporary relevance. So prevailing historical scholarship on the Tao Te Ching has concluded the following. There is no evidence the work was written by the mythic figure of Lao Tzu or Lao Dan in the 6th century BCE. It is a collection of mostly rhyme verse that contains some framing, and it was built up at a number of stages that cannot now be readily ascertained. It represents a literary genre of what I've called Daoist wisdom poetry that also includes Guanz's 4 techniques of the mind text, especially the oldest of them, Inward Training, that I wrote my second book on. It happens to be the single oldest text devoted to breathing meditation, to breath attention meditation in the entire Daoist tradition, Chinese tradition, and in all of East Asia. That book is called Original Tao. A complete 81-chapter version seems to have been established by the middle of the 3rd century BCE, so sometime around 270 BCE, and not earlier, despite the myths that have been propagated about Lao Tzu being the 6th century BCE teacher of Confucius. That always smacked to me of a bit of spiritual polemics, and if you really look at it carefully, it is, because it's a kind of one-upmanship. I mean, supposedly, according to the legend, Lao Tzu is the guy who had a position in the state historiographer's office, and Confucius went to visit him to ask him how to perform his own essential practice, that is, rites and rituals, better. And of course, Lao Tzu schooled him. But of course, that bespeaks of there being a conflict between established Confucian traditions and upstart Taoist traditions, where our guy, who turns out to be the founder of the tradition, actually schooled your guy in your essential practices. So we beat you. That's that's why historical scholarship and a critical eye is helpful in getting clear on things like this. The work's not an isolated text. It's part of a readily discernible tradition I call an intercultivation tradition. It's what the earliest Chinese historians called Daoist. Right. So if this is where we stop, then we remain solidly within the parameters of a traditional religious studies approach, where the contemplative studies approach differs is in adding to this the perspectives gained from critical first-person experience, which, unlike committed first-person experience, includes third-person scientific research, such as that on concentrative and receptive forms of meditation. Now, this research is based on the following set of assumptions. Despite vast differences, and these are controversial, I will admit these are controversial, but certainly happy to discuss them. Despite vast differences in cultural contexts, human beings in the 3rd century BCE in China had essentially the same physiology of body and mind as do modern humans. And thus, practicing breath meditation should have largely similar physiological effects on them as it does on us, although we, of course, conceive of the underlying mechanisms in entirely different fashions, and we should understand what those different fashions are. So the Lao Tzu and its distinct defining concept of the way was created by a lineage of teachers and students who were grounded in the practice of focusing the attention on the breath, a concentration practice I've called inner cultivation. They were not, as is often assumed in a rather culturally blinkered fashion, a group of abstract philosophers who offered metaphysical speculations that were not grounded in their own personal experience. Much of the insights about inner cultivation in this work seem couched in deliberately opaque or metaphoric language designed to be understood within a small circle of practitioners. Additional interpretive challenges come from the fact that each of the 81 chapters, or zhang, is a completely individual composition, such that each chapter contains a number of component sections that could stand on their own. Centuries of commentators have tried to read each chapter as the consistent thought of an individual author. It's much more likely, however, that each chapter is woven carefully from several components, perhaps an original saying or verse. You have to remember that this is a pre-literate culture, so how were ideas transmitted? They were primarily transmitted orally. And in the early Daoist tradition, they were transmitted in two basic forms. One of those forms is through stories, through narratives, through didactic narratives. And the second of those forms is through regularly rhymed verse. So the Tao Te Ching, about 2/3 of it consists of sections of rhymed verse that are framed, that are put together, that are woven together by a composer who may not have shared exactly the same point of view as the creators of the component elements that are woven together to form the chapters. And I hope I can show you this in a sec. See if this works. Oh, so the oldest series of textual parallels that we've been able to discover came from a tomb in Guodian that was in China, in Hubei province, that was sealed in around the year 310 BCE. It's it's more than a half a millennium older than anything we have now. It's actually probably a whole millennium older than anything we have now, with the exception of another excavation, which I won't talk about today. It's too detailed. And it contains, these Guodian parallels contain material that are also found in 32 of the 81 chapters of the Tao Te Ching. 11 of the 32 contain only subsections of specific chapters in the Tao Te Ching, and they are distinct syntactic and semantic units. So I'd like to present two examples related to inner cultivation practice that if we understand them as being built up from smaller units, we can kind of get a little clearer on what they were intended to include. And also if we bring in our understanding of scientific research on meditation, then also I think it helps. So, this is a very famous passage in Tao Te Ching chapter 5 that many of you may have heard of, the straw dogs. So all other versions begin with the top lines. Heaven and earth are not empathetic. They treat the myriad things like straw dogs. Sages are not empathetic. They treat the myriad things like straw dogs. That's in all other editions, not in these parallel texts, which only contain the following lines. The space between heaven and earth, it is not like a bellows, or is it not like a bellows? Empty it out, and it is not exhausted. Activate it, and it continues to come forth. And then all other versions continue. Many words arise, many words disappear. Better to hold fast to the center. So really the only part of that text which we have in the oldest surviving textual parallels is the central part that I have there in caps. So this 4th century BCE parallel doesn't really have the straw dog statement in it at all. And commentators for centuries have tried to interpret the entire chapter as a unified whole. But yet its oldest version centers on this metaphor of the bellows. Taking a critical first-person approach to this passage leads to the assumption that it could refer not only, again, critical first-person perspective that is based upon what we know about forms of meditation practice that have been done in other traditions and that we are also doing and that we're studying scientifically. That the idea that the space between heaven and earth, which everybody thought referred to the macrocosm, it actually, when you think about it in terms of a contemplative focus, could actually refer to the microcosm experience of an individual practicing meditation. Um, Furthermore, the bellows analogy seen here is also found. We're very lucky to have this. So another tomb that was excavated back about 45 years ago at Mawangdui, they found a series of medical texts, some of which contain specific instructions on meditation, one of which is called the 10 Questions, and one of which contains actual meditation practice in which they talk about breathing like a bellows. And in a few minutes, we'll actually try that out once we understand what the bellows was like. So in that, breathing like a bellows circulates breath or chi throughout the body. There's another passage that parallels Lao Tzu 16. Attaining emptiness is the apogee of our practice. Holding fast to the center is its governing mode. The myriad things rise side by side, and residing here, I slowly see them return. The forms of heaven are great in number, but each returns to its root. Here there appears to be two distinct units. Looking through the lens of critical first-person perspectives, the first line speaks of an increased inner focused attention practice, and the second appears to be a phenomenological description of meditation experience, perhaps even an actual technique. Keeping with our first-person perspective, the remainder of this passage seems to deal with the experience of watching the myriad things, thoughts, feelings, images, arise in consciousness. It's kind of like a receptive form of meditation, an open awareness form of meditation. Thus, there's a kind of interesting conversion between third-person historical and textual study and first-person study, supporting the hypothesis that a form of focused attention on one's breathing was an important practice in the group that created the Tao Te Ching. So these are essential elements in critical first-person methodologies. We're down to this idea of reconstructed meditations. There's yet this other dimension of critical first-person contemplative studies, methods. We can use them to actually attempt an imaginative reconstruction of what an actual practice might have been like to the compilers of the Tao Te Ching. So, coming back to this passage, the space between heaven and earth, is it not like a bellows? And I told you that it's linked with meditation. Now, when I think of a bellows, this is what I think of. So when I first started reconstructing this meditation in the classroom, that's what I had students imagine. But actually, we are able to discover that the bellows was very, very different. The ancient bellows very different. This is a picture of essentially the same bellows that's been used for 2 millennia. And notice it's got a handle and it's got a mouth. It's not like this, but it's like this. So, one of the forms of contemplative reconstructed practice that I've tried with my students in the classroom is asking them to sit upright in a comfortable position with their eyes closed, and then imagine that your diaphragm is like a bellows. And then because the mouth is a little pursed, I have students purse their lips, and as you breathe in and out, it's like pulling the handle down and pushing it up. Pulling the handle down and pushing it up. Unfortunately, it's probably not enough time to actually try this out, but we'll try the second one out. So again, this passage about holding fast to the center. Attaining emptiness is the apogee of our practice. Holding fast to the center is its governing mode, and so on. So Lao Tzu recommends gradually emptying out consciousness through this process of holding fast to the center. So actually, let's just take a couple minutes to try this out. So this is the kind of thing we do in the classroom. So, sit upright in your chair. And concentrate on your breathing where it happens to be centered in your abdomen. So carefully, put your hands either on your knees or in this circular mudra. Good to do this with your eyes closed. And set up your container, your sphere of experience, 4 dimensions: height, width, depth, and time. Take 3 deep and relaxing breaths, breathing into your whole sphere. And as you're sitting here, inevitably, focusing on your breathing, inevitably, thoughts will arise and pass away. Feelings will arise and pass away. Perceptions will arise and pass away. So as you keep focusing on your breathing, notice how they seem to come out of nowhere and go back into nowhere. This constant rising and falling of our experience, everything returning, as the passage says, to its root. It's inevitable. No need to react to them, and simply maintain an awareness of the center of your breathing. So from a contemplative studies perspective, I'm going to let people do this for just a minute or so to give you a sense of what it's like. So focus on your breathing and watch the rising and falling of things. Slowly open your eyes. Sorry, we don't have more time to do this. Often find myself not wanting the meditation session to end. So the arising of things side by side obviously can refer, if we change this perspective, to look at first-person experience as simply the arising of the different phenomena in consciousness that come about. So reconstructive meditations like this help give scholars and students a sense of the possible experiential basis that underlie these kinds of passages, and they can thus provide a distinctive way to approach the meaning of contemplative texts like the Tao Te Ching without either distorting them to conform to modern Western sensibilities or reducing them to deliberately self-contradictory platitudes intended to deliberately confuse or create inauthentic profundities. Thus, critical first-person methodologies consisting of third-person scientific research and humanistic research in combination with first-person experiential epistemologies not only provides new insights into the history of the text and its connection to human experience, they can also contribute some insights into the nature of consciousness that some may find of contemporary relevance once we are able to distinguish the distinctive differences in culture, history, and context. So we now arrive at what we actually do in the classroom. I'd like to give you some more specific examples of the ways in which we combine these complementary perspectives as the hallmark of our developing field. So we have, at Brown, it started as an initiative, and now we have the first undergraduate major at a major research university in North America. Our work is based also on the work of 4 science labs. Many of you are familiar with the work of Willoughby Britton and Kathy Kerr. Eric Laux, who's actually here at the conference, is a public health mindfulness teacher. Tara White has just joined us, works on the neural basis of emotion. So, what we study here are the 3 basic areas of contemplative studies, science, and this will just give you some idea of the range of courses that we've been able to generate. COST, by the way, is the acronym for contemplative studies. We had a limited number of possible options, I think. So anyway, I guess because our son is going to Brown, this one cropped up. What's the true cost of a Brown education? And so we have a full range of humanities courses related, and we also have a number of really wonderful creative arts courses. Very interesting range of courses that we're able to teach. It's taken over 10 years to put together this group and this collection of courses, but students now have, we just graduated our first class of contemplative studies majors last spring, a small class of 5. If you've bumped into Carly Margolis, she's working for the Mind and Life Institute, and she's one of our graduates. And we've got 17 more students in the pipeline. So as we bring contemplative studies methods into the classroom, we have these interactive perspectives, and I think that you're familiar with them, so I won't go into them in detail. So I'd like to talk, however, in more detail just a little bit about this one course, Intro to Contemplative Studies, which is the fundamental methods course for our concentration. So in the weekly seminar, we do both readings that refer to the kind of major theoretical works of the field, and these include Alan Wallace's work, the work of Varela and Thompson, and so on, Jim Austin's books. We also read primary texts on meditation and translation, and then in the meditation labs, we do things like we just did. We try out contemplative practices that are directly related to the readings, without any commitment to the truth claims that are in the text, but we learn what they are, and then students get a chance to test them out themselves. Here's where we worked on the bellows breathing and the centered observation as we did it, as the passage that I just went over. So we actually physically have a wonderful space. We often use the dance studio. We're very fortunate that dancers like to stay up late because then they don't get up early. And we can get in there at early hours and set up our meditation labs. We always start in the med labs with a kind of yoga practice, concentrating on the positions that will loosen up and make more flexible students so that they can sit cross-legged, although of course they're not required to. And then we work with a contemplative technique for the specific lab. We have, for 20 or 30 minutes, we have time for students to write comments, questions on note cards. They ask questions, and then they've got a few minutes to write on note cards. So basically, these practices in the classroom are focused on, third-person perspectives of the kind we readily use throughout the university, and that we're all familiar with. Second-person perspectives include peer-led presentations of reading. Students work together. Students talking on a one-on-one basis, both with me, with the TAs, with themselves on what they're experiencing in the labs. First-person practices are actually learning the practices in the med labs, and also giving them an opportunity, because a lot of these courses will involve introducing them to a series of different contemplative practices in this context, learning which practices are more effective for them, and then applying these at home, and then journaling. And no-person perspectives really include the immediate momentary experience of in-breathing and out-breathing, the sensations of sound, the feeling of the body as a whole, whatever stimuli are present without the interference of processing through self-identity. So it is through these pedagogical methods that we attempt to model for our students the distinctive aspects of critical first-person methodologies that we advocate for the field. Taken together, they represent a way to incorporate subjective experience into rational, scientific, and humanistic discourse, especially when it comes to the study of human consciousness, its structure, functioning, and potential for development. Such methods are of particular importance, but there is also a larger import. Too often throughout human history, first-person perspectives have been totally ignored. Human subjective experience has been often written out of social, political, and economic decision-making with often tragic consequences. If we take into account both our own first-person experiences and those of other ethnicities, other cultures, other political persuasions. We cannot create a reality in which the common humanity we share with them is ignored. But as we've seen, if this first-person experience does not both cultivate the no-person experience that is embedded within it and is not tempered with third-person and second-person perspectives that make it truly critical, it can become biased and so specifically individualistic that dangerous results can develop if such a blinkered perspective gains political and cultural authority. For these reasons, both relevant internally to our developing academic field and to the larger national and world cultures that are simultaneously evolving, we cannot forget what's critical about critical first-person perspectives. And I thank you very much for your patience. So I'm sorry I went on a little longer than intended. We have about 5 minutes for questions, and there are microphones set up on either side of the room, and I'll certainly be happy afterwards to talk individually to you or in groups about some of the issues. So on this side.
Thank you very much. Two somewhat related questions. One is that during various moments in shamatha Mahamudra experiences, I have a sense of non-conceptual awareness, which is immediately torn to shreds by my comments about how I have sensed some non-conceptual awareness, and subsequent realization that I didn't really experience anything of the sort. And I dig deeper, and there's just layers and layers and layers of stories and concepts being created about those moments. So, you know, the somewhat question is, since I'm not a meditator going off in a cave for 10 years, eating nettles, how likely is it that actual people can achieve this situation of the view from nowhere? Second related question has to do with the idea of intersubjectivity of science. And
of the what of science?
Intersubjectivity, the idea that you communicate scientific results with concepts, and you're trying to communicate a pure experience, which is non-conceptual. Isn't there a contradiction there? So how can this possibly be scientific at all?
Well, I mean, it's scientific because of the combination of taking subjective reports of first-person experience or the subjective experience of researchers themselves and communicating it within a larger context, which includes third-person perspectives. And that also kind of relates to your first question, because there's this dynamic relationship going on between no-person experience and the other levels, first and second and third-person experience. So yes, I think it's possible to kind of alter the way in which your consciousness works. You don't have to go and spend your life in a monastery, or you can if you choose to do that, but you can actually do periods of meditation and then come back into the world. And as long as you are able to set aside through the focus of your attention the cares and concerns that we normally carry with us, you can cultivate increasing levels of no-person experience that then will carry over into your everyday life and transform the way in which you experience the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Oren.
Hi. I have probably 10 questions, and none of them are formulated in a way that'll be understandable. But I'm trying to figure out what I'm asking here, so I'll just say some things and maybe you'll respond. So, first, there's this no-person perspective, if it's a perspective at all, and then there's the critical first person.
Yeah.
Now, there's a leap between the two that's unwarranted in some sense, which makes it difficult to say what does first critical perspective build on at all? If it's not on itself or something like that. That's one thing. And it relates to the other question, the relation between critical first-person perspective and language in general. While you're in no-person perspective, it seems that everything is possible, pretty much. I mean, it's a situation where there's a raw experience and all interpretations are possible. And then first-person experience comes in there and makes it particular. And but I'm not sure about that. But and third, I'm left with the question: what's critical about first-person perspective? What's the object that it's trying to critique? I hope I made some sense.
Okay, I hope that I understood what you're asking. So what's critical about critical first-person perspectives is that they contextualize our first-person and no-person experiences within larger contexts. So we bring to those the critical awareness that this is the practice, this is the framework in which the practice is embedded, but one of the really important issues is that because we can bring critical third-person perspectives to bear on that we don't have to accept the veridicality of those first-person experiences. We can simply test them out themselves. We don't have to take the word for different traditions. We have the opportunity to check ourselves. That's, I think, one of the key things about what's critical. One of the issues about the content of no-person experience. It's not completely contentless, but it's non-self-referential. So no-person experience can be a thought, a feeling, a perception, the sound of the bell itself. So there's always content to it. That's one place where people disagree. Nishida Kitaro actually has this wonderful way of talking about the contentless no-person experience. And there are certain types of no-person experiences which are contentless. One of the wonderful contrasts that Nishida makes and Nishitani makes, the Japanese philosophers, are that he says in the West, in philosophy, and you talk about the fact that you have experiences because you have a self. But he said, in the Buddhist tradition, what we say is, because there is experience, a self arises. That's a difference in words, but it's also a difference in ways of approach to the continuum of experience. So experience happens whether or not a self arises. And it's the way in which we have a self-identity that we not only arises, but we become attached to, that is the cause from the Buddhist perspective of a lot of different suffering and ignorance. And then the relationship of critical first person and language. Yeah. Could you focus a little more on the question?
Well, it returns back to that. I understand that there's content to no person. But then the content becomes interpreted through first person.
Yeah.
And then the critical first person perspective becomes a very specified kind of understanding of the no person content. And that is a place that in itself invites critique, in the sense that the leap into the first person conceptualization becomes a possibility. That's all. Just a particular possibility.
But as long as you keep referring it back to no person experience through some sort of contemplative practice, which brings that out more, which brings that more into your everyday experience, it then tends to reduce the amount of subjective bias and partiality with which you contextualize what these direct and immediate experiences are. That's one of the contentions of Jim Austin in separating egocentric and allocentric arising from various contemplative practices. Happy to talk more to you. I think we have time for one last question.
Hello. I just had a quick question. It's slightly tangential and like particularly not terribly eloquently worded, but nevertheless, would you mind speaking to the kind of inherently spiritual aspects of contemplative studies and the application of that in like a secular environment? Do you think there are aspects that are lost? Do you think that there are aspects that are gained? And like, how do you kind of balance that?
That's a wonderful question. One of the important hallmarks of bringing contemplative practice from a religious context into a secular context is that we can't ask our students to believe in the truth, the veridicality of the religious framework, the cognitive framework that surrounds the contemplative practice. So that's, it's then, are we taking away what's, quote, spiritual about it? I mean, is what's spiritual about it the commitment to a certain set of beliefs, or is what's spiritual about it the actual experience itself? Then what happens, I think one of the things that's been talked about under this topic most commonly is mindfulness-based stress reduction, created by John Kabat-Zinn. We all know what that is. It's kind of a deracinated form of a contemplative practice, actually combines several different contemplative practices. And so one of the issues that's been raised is, well, a lot of contemplative practices that we know from religious traditions occur within an ethical framework. So what happens when you don't require that ethical framework also be part of it? There are lots of practical reasons why, if you brought the ethical and spiritual framework along, why the particular practices themselves would not be accepted and acceptable for use, because they contain a certain religious commitment that people who are not practicing that religion shouldn't be asked to make. So what happens? So one of the things that's most interesting is, do the practices themselves inherently change the way in which we experience the world? So for example, I think one of the things that John advocates is that doing the actual practice tends to take a very self-focused, or what Jim Austin calls an egocentric orientation, and turn it to an allocentric orientation, so that as a result of doing the practice, you develop more pro-social and other regarding attitudes that are often accompanied or are often linked to the ethical systems that surround religion. This is one of the very complicated questions also about the transmission of different forms of religious practice and religious traditions from Asia to the West. What's essential in the practice of the religion? And this is relevant both for contemplative practice communities in the West, as well as scientists who are looking and pulling out the contemplative practices. And I always phrase it with my students about, well, exactly what's the baby and what's the bathwater, right? So you know that old phrase, don't be careful not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Actually, maybe some of you young people don't know what that refers to, but it refers to a time before bathtubs when you had to bathe your children, your little babies, in a basin, and then the water got dirty, and what's the baby, what's the bathwater? When I first started eating Chinese food, I used chopsticks, and I was very, very, I couldn't master it. I have fine motor skill challenges, anyway. And so the rice would come up to my mouth, and it would fall off, and how characteristic of the Asian contemplative mode of doing things, that the very utensils that you use force you to eat slowly and contemplatively. And then my Chinese advisor invited me to dinner, and he at the beginning put a bowl of rice up to his mouth and basically inhaled it with the chopsticks. Another Orientalism bites the dust. So what's essential is, when we first, I've been associated with the Rinzai Zen community in Los Angeles for a long time. We started, we always ate with only chopsticks, for our meals, and people were eating kind of slowly. The food was falling all over the place. Did we really need to use chopsticks as part of Zen practice? Well, of course not. So these are, we're at an interesting point in the evolution of, in the transmission of Buddhism from, and Taoism and Confucianism and all the various Hindu practices from Asia to the West. We're really in the early stages. I know most about Buddhism because that's what I've studied. When Buddhism moves into a particular country, it adapts a lot from the existing culture and changes and transforms. So we're in the very early stages here of the transformation of Buddhism in the West. And so people are still sorting out, what ways in which the traditional practices need to be changed or need to be recontextualized without losing the heart of the practices. So one of the really interesting phenomena is that in most other situations, Buddhism worked with existing religions and developed new fusions and new practices based on those religions. But here, and this directly results in what we're doing this weekend, is that Buddhism is actually working more with scientific models than the existing religious systems. And so the kind of new Buddhist modernism that David McMahon talks about that's developing here is kind of a fusion. It's the way in which Buddhism is now adapting to this series of cultures that it's encountering in North America, South America, and Europe, and hopefully eventually Africa. That His Holiness the Dalai Lama is going to have a Mind and Life dialogue in Botswana next summer. So things are changing and transforming. So I think with that, I'm going to thank you for your patience, thank you for coming, and wish you well for the rest of the symposium.